Today's seminar, identify project stakeholders. That's the first step that we have to do. And of course, stakeholders are very important to our project, and they are very important to provide us with our requirements that we need for the project. So once I've identified them, what do I do next? PSI Project Management, we've been around since 2002, and our focus is on teaching project management courses. We provide open enrollment courses. We also provide corporate courses, which are closed and specific to a corporation. I've been a PMP now for quite a few years, and I've been teaching project management since about 2008, and I am an authorized training partner instructor. So I've been through their prep courses and so forth that enables me to have that certification. I do have a lot of experience in project management, national and international experience, and you can also see that I have experience in aviation and spent a number of years in aviation in my early career. This is what we call the framework for project management or project management structure. This is out of the PMBOK Guide, the 6th edition, which is still a primary book because it gives us best practices. And so what we have in this is our 10 by 5 by 49. So we have our 10 knowledge areas, we have our 5 process groups, and then we have our 49 different processes internal to this framework. Those are the processes that we use to help us manage our projects. Now today we are focused on the project stakeholder management right here at the bottom in that red box. We are going to focus on those processes that are related to the stakeholders. So first of all, what is a stakeholder? Kind of important to understand what they are. A stakeholder is a person that is impacted by the project, either positively or negatively. They may have an interest in the project, or they may think they have an interest in the project. Now that's a broad term, isn't it? That's a broad description of what a stakeholder is. Stakeholders can be suppliers, they can be customers, managers, supervisors, and we have to understand who our stakeholders are. Now I was working with one lady in Greenville, and it's been a couple of years ago, and I asked her, I said, well, who are your stakeholders? And she said, well, my boss, my boss's boss, my boss's boss's boss, and so forth. And I said, well, think about it now. Who are the people that are going to be impacted by this project? Who are the people that are going to use what you're going to be delivering? And she said, oh, okay, well, this is this group over here. And so that's the approach we have to take to our stakeholders. Yes, we have to keep the bosses happy, but guess what? If you don't keep your key stakeholders happy, that feedback is going to get back to the bosses, and they're not going to be happy either. So make sure you understand who your stakeholders are. This shows kind of a span of who potential stakeholders might be. Certainly the project manager is a stakeholder. The team and resource managers, those people are very important. They are going to have the resources that you need to execute your project. So you need certainly to get them involved in the project. Your sponsor, governing bodies, maybe you have a governing body that manages or oversees all the projects, or a steering committee. You may have a project management office. If you have any of those situations, then that would be certainly a stakeholder. But then you have your stakeholders, suppliers, customers, and end users. And of course, all of these are the people that will be giving you requirements and using what you're going to be delivering. And we need to understand who those people are. So our first process that we're going to talk about is identify stakeholders. That's key to every project. Identify stakeholders. Now, the output of this process is the stakeholder register. The stakeholder register is where we list all the people, the groups. Stakeholders could be groups, could be an organization, the people or whatever is going to be impacted by the project. So this is a flow chart that I use in my practical project management course, which takes the 10 by 5 by 49 and it puts it into a practical flow that we can easily use to help us manage our projects with. And that's from the Practical Project Management course. Now you can see I've highlighted 4 different processes here. The first process is identify stakeholders. That's the one we're talking about now. Once we've identified the stakeholders, then we will plan stakeholder engagement. Keeping a stakeholder engaged in a project is critically important. If we keep our stakeholders engaged in the project, then in all likelihood we're going to have a successful project. If we don't, then in all likelihood our project is not going to be successful. So once we've developed that stakeholder engagement plan, as we look down to the bottom left, we see that we manage the stakeholder engagement. So we execute that stakeholder engagement plan to get our stakeholders engaged. Once we are in the process of executing that plan, then we monitor the stakeholder engagement. Anytime we have a plan and we're executing a plan, we want to monitor it to make sure we're executing it in accordance with the plan. So those are the 4 different processes that we'll be talking about today. Now, first of all, as I said, we're going to start with identify stakeholders. This is the framework that I put together out of the 6th edition of the PMBOK Guide. And it tells us every process in project management has inputs, it has tools and techniques, and it has outputs. The inputs are the information, the things that are needed to be able to do the process. We take those inputs and use tools and techniques to analyze it, to create what we want for our output. So in this case, our output is going to be the stakeholder register primarily. That's right here. So now what do we have as inputs? If you would look back at that flow chart, you'd see this is the second process. This is right after we have a project charter. So we don't have much information on our project at this point in time. We do have a project charter, and that project charter may contain names of people that are stakeholders. We might have, for example, an agreement, a contract to do this project for someone else. That agreement may have, in fact, some contacts, some stakeholders, and so forth. Other than that, we don't have much information. You see a lot of inputs listed here, but guess what? They're not inputs at this point because it's too early in the project. I do have what's called enterprise environmental factors, which will contain, for example, an organizational structure of all the people in the organization. So I can go to that. That would be a reference. I do have organizational process assets right here. OPA contains information on previous projects. I can go to those projects perhaps and look. That may help me to understand who my stakeholders are as well. We're going to reach out. I call it beating the bushes. We're going to beat the bushes to come up with all of the key stakeholders for our project. We're going to use expert judgment as a tool. If we have a lot of stakeholders, we may use questionnaires and surveys. Then, after we create our stakeholder register, we're going to start analyzing our stakeholders and updating our stakeholder register to reflect that also. So the key output of identify stakeholders is the stakeholder register. So this contains a list of all key stakeholders. It may have and should have their position or their role as it relates to the project. Maybe contact information, could have communication requirements, project expectations, it should have. And then we're going to classify our stakeholders relative to their importance on the project. We have to assess them. We have to understand our stakeholders. We have to understand their needs. We also have to understand the communication requirements. Think about it this way. 90% of a project manager's time is spent communicating. 50% of it is spent communicating with the team members. Another 50% is going to be spent communicating with other people, such as your stakeholders. We also have to have this stakeholder engagement plan and manage it. So if I look at a stakeholder register, and as you can see here, so you can see that you have a lot of different things on the stakeholder register. You have, for example, the name of the stakeholder, their position or their role, their contact information, their communication requirements, their project expectations, and then their attitude towards the project itself. When I say attitude, I mean, are they really leading? They really want this project? Are they resistant to the project? Are they neutral? Exactly what is their project status and their status towards the project itself? We need to understand that. We'll do more about that in just a minute. In this process, called planned stakeholder engagement, we are going to create the stakeholder engagement plan. So what we're going to do is we're going to take each stakeholder, each key stakeholder, and we're going to decompose it down and understand that stakeholder completely. And then we're going to define how we're going to address each stakeholder. So this plan provides us with the strategies to engage the stakeholder throughout the project life cycle. And we're going to develop and understand their needs, their interests, and their potential impact on the project. If you have a key stakeholder that has the ability or the power to say this project is killed, then you'd better be aware of that and you'd better manage that particular situation. So here is the planned stakeholder engagement process, the framework. Once again, at this point, I may not have enough information to do this completely. But remember, progressive elaboration, as I'm going through this, for example, I may identify some new stakeholders. If I do, I'm going to go back to my stakeholder register and update it. As I'm doing something else in the project, I may understand something more about one of the stakeholders. And I may come back to my stakeholder engagement plan and update it. So these plans are constantly updated. As I learn new information, I will update to reflect that new information. So at this point in time, I have my project charter. Good information there. High level information, but good information. I will also have an agreement if I am the seller. I'm doing this project for someone else. I will have my stakeholder register. That will contain the stakeholders that I have identified so far, and I will then update that to reflect what I'm going to do to engage my stakeholders, and or I'm going to start creating my stakeholder engagement plan. Now I'm going to use several different tools to help me understand my stakeholders. For example, I'm going to use mind mapping or a stakeholder engagement assessment matrix, also known as a SEAM. I might use a power interest grid, other types of things such as that, a salience model to do the prioritization and the ranking of them. But the output of this process is going to be the stakeholder engagement plan. Remember, Keeping them engaged in a project is critical to the project's success. Now, from a personal experience, I was working with a company out in Fergus Falls, Minnesota, and I was in there to do an assessment of their new product introduction processes. Well, there were 3 key people there. The owner, who was the dad, and 2 sons. One of the sons worked in the business locally. The other son was a new product development person, and he worked out in Minneapolis. Well, they needed help with their new product introduction process, and that was my area of expertise at that point in time. So I go in there, I do all my assessment, I tell them what we need to do and all this, and there was to be a big project to follow this project after I was completed with it. The guy in Minneapolis, I just didn't like. I don't know any other way to put it. I didn't like the guy. I didn't understand his impact on the project. Well, his dad even told me a couple of times, Roy, you need to talk to whatever his name was and get him on board with the project. But I blew it off. I didn't even talk to him about it. I called the guy and talked to him a couple of times, and this guy told me, he said, well, I didn't want you there in the first place. I can do what you're doing and so forth and so on. So he didn't want me in there in the first place. So that told me right off the bat that I should be talking to this guy, but I didn't. I'm a little bit hard-headed sometimes, okay? So anyway, we get to the end of that project, talking to the owner about it. He says, unfortunately, we're not going to be able to go forward with the next project because John, or whatever his name was, kind of nixed it. He said he didn't want to do it. So the bottom line to this whole scenario is I did not get the follow-up job because I did not get that stakeholder engaged. I fell down in two specific areas: stakeholder engagement and stakeholder communications. And those 2 areas caused me to lose that project. Had I really analyzed that stakeholder and understood and taking my biases out of the picture, then I could have probably gone to Minneapolis and talk to him, take him out to dinner, different things, and get him on board with the project. But I chose not to do that. And as a result, I lost that project. So planned stakeholder engagement, analyzing stakeholders, is certainly very critical to your project. So you want to establish their current and their desired project position. For example, Dad, in this case, was leading. He wanted it. The other son was neutral, but then the second son was negative. He was resistant. I should have established those positions, and I should have worked on getting that person that was negative to at least to a neutral position. So you rank and you prioritize. I didn't realize the importance of the guy in Minneapolis. Use tools such as stakeholder analysis, salience model, power influence grids, which we will look at in just a moment. So the stakeholder engagement plan has several items in it that we need to understand. First of all, who is the stakeholder? What is their position to the project? Are they unaware? Are they resistant? Are they neutral? Are they supportive? Or are they leading? Not only do I need to understand their current position, but I need to understand their desired position. The guy in Minneapolis, the desired position would have been neutral. The current position was resistant. To analyze that and to understand that takes interaction with the stakeholders and your personal assessment or experience in understanding the stakeholder's position. I move to the next part of this stakeholder engagement plan: pending stakeholder changes. Is there a critical person that's going to be leaving the organization? Or is there going to be some changes such as maybe new management coming in. Those are important things I need to understand. The relationships of the stakeholders. This doesn't have to be a family relationship. It could be a relationship between groups or whatever the case may be. It could be family related. In my case, with this example I gave you, it would certainly be family relationships. But I need to understand, what are those relationships? So now the stakeholders themselves, I list them name by name. So I should have had Dad, son number 1, and son number 2. Dad, what would be my approach? He's leading. He wants this thing to be done. And so I'm going to certainly communicate with Dad on an ongoing basis and keeping him abreast of what's going on, as well as hyping to him so that he will continue wanting this project. Number 1, let's say, son number 1. He's neutral. I'd like to move son number 1 to a supporting position. How am I going to do that? And maybe it's talking with him, getting him involved with me as I'm developing this and showing him how it's going to improve his work and his product in the shop. And then son number 2, how am I going to get him? He's negative. And that's always a tough case when you have someone like that that's critical, but they're negative to a project. So you're going to have to understand that person better. You're going to have to communicate a lot with them. You're going to have to teach them or help them understand how this will work, how it will improve the results, and how it will improve their manufacturing capabilities. So you need to understand each stakeholder and what you need to do to get each stakeholder engaged and to move them to the desired position in that stakeholder assessment matrix that we did before. Or we'll look at this in the next slide, actually. So here is the stakeholder assessment matrix. So now you take John. John's unaware. He's out in La La Land. And I'd like to move John to the desired position of neutral. Then I have Sam. Sam is resistant. But Sam's important. I need Sam to be in a leading position. That's going to be a long haul, isn't it? To move someone from resistant to leading. That's really going to be difficult to do, but in this case, that's what we need to do. I look at Ann. Ann is currently neutral, and I'd like to move Ann to supportive. So we identify the current position of each stakeholder. Then, once we've identified their current position, we move them, or we identify then the desired position for those individuals. So then we update the stakeholder register to reflect the stakeholder's position relative to the project. Document the plan in the stakeholder register and how each stakeholder is going to be moved from the current position to the desired position. So let's go back here for 1 second and look at this stakeholder engagement plan. And you'll see here, again, that we have the unaware, resistant, neutral, supportive, and leading, and for each of the stakeholders. And then we'll have general comments about them. Take John, for example. John's excited about the house, the area, and the new job. Nancy is concerned about the move and all the work that's involved. Nancy is a worrywart. Pete was a child. He's a child, and Hank and Sue are children. And they don't want to move and leave their friends. We go to the second page. We talked about pending stakeholder changes. We talked about stakeholder relationships. Here are the approaches we will use for these stakeholders. So John will keep him in the decision-making loop and communicate frequently. Nancy will frequently be in communication with her and focus on relieving her anxiety regarding the move. Pete will look for a location where he and his siblings will be able to make new friends, where there's lots of opportunities. He's a people person. Hank is an outdoors person. He likes to fish. Maybe we can locate property that would be near a lake or a river. And then Sue loves sports. So if we can get Sue next to a sports area, then that would certainly be an asset and help her to accept the move easier. What is John's current position? So you see, here is the plan right here. This is the plan. That's how I'm going to move them from current position to the desired position. But periodically, I want to go back and I want to check to see how I am progressing. For example, is Nancy's apprehension decreasing? Is she becoming more accepting of the move? How about Pete? How about Hank? How about Sue? What is their current positions? Are they making progress? That's the key that we want to see. In the stakeholder assessment matrix I showed you, we had one person that was moving from currently resistant to leading. That was the desired position. You're not going to do that overnight, but you want to make sure that you're making progress. So periodically, you go back and you review your stakeholders. You review how they're progressing towards the desired position that you have for them on the project. And you can see I made a comment here that it's important to make sure that Nancy's apprehension is minimized and that we do address the children's concerns about the move. So that's a stakeholder engagement plan. Very, very important. It is really critical to the project itself. We have another tool that's called a salience model. In this, we are ranking the stakeholders for their level of importance to the project. Power. What is their level of power? How much power do they have? The guy in Fergus Falls, the son, number 1 or 2, he had a lot of power. I didn't realize the level of power that son had. Legitimacy. What is their legitimacy? Are they legitimate? What is their urgency? We need to understand power, legitimacy, and urgency. So you take number 2 is out in La La Land. They're unaware of the project, really. Number 1 has legitimacy. Number 6 has urgency. And number 3 has power. So each one of those will get a score of 1. However, stakeholder number 5 has power and legitimacy. So number 5 is going to get a score of 2. Number 7 has power and urgency, so they get a score of 2. Number 4 has power, urgency, and legitimacy. Number 4 is going to get a score of 3. So I'm understanding in this case who has the power, who is most important, what is the priority for each stakeholder with regards to this project. I need to know that. If I had known that in that Fergus Falls job, then I would have addressed it and I would have got the follow-up job. We have what's called a power interest grid. So the power, high power would be right here, low power here, low interest would be here, high interest would be here. What is each stakeholder? Where do they fit into this grid? The ones that fall into the grid top right, they have power and they have high power and they have high interest. In the lower right, they have low power but high interest. Top left, they have high power and low interest. And then in the bottom right, they have low power and low interest. Basically, in this category here, anybody that's in the high range here, we want to manage them very closely. We want to keep the people that have the interest but low power informed. The people that have low interest and low power, we want to monitor because it can change. The people that have high power and low interest, we want to keep satisfied. So if I add another cross to this, the key stakeholders are the people to the right of that orange area. Those are the key stakeholders. These are the people that we will be collecting our requirements from. However, we want to monitor, we want to make sure we stay on top of the other people because things change. So we need to keep tabs on those people as well to make sure that there's nothing taking place that we should be aware of and that would change our mind with regards to what grid they fall in. And that's called the power interest grid. This is the stakeholder analysis form here. So let's look at an actual form. And you'll see that we have the name of the person, the stakeholder. We have their level of interest. We have their influence. And we have their position to the project. So this stakeholder analysis gives us foundational information on every stakeholder that will help us to develop the stakeholder engagement plan and certainly help us to manage our stakeholders. So manage stakeholder engagement process. We have a plan. We have a stakeholder engagement plan. We want to manage that plan. We want to manage the stakeholders. We want to execute the plan. This is where we will communicate and work with the stakeholders to meet their needs and their expectations. We'll address issues. We will foster stakeholder engagement. Here is managed stakeholder engagement process. And of course we have several important inputs here. We have the stakeholder engagement plan, which is primary. We have the stakeholder register. There are some other important inputs into this process as well, and as we develop those, we will also use those to help us manage the stakeholders, such as the communications management plan. Communications management plan tells us who we're going to be communicating, the stakeholder, what we're going to be communicating, how often we'll be communicating, what format, and then who is responsible for those communications. Every project needs a communications management plan, and it is certainly used in conjunction with the stakeholder engagement plan. We also have an issues log. Are there issues with the stakeholders that you need to be aware of? You know, all issues have to be worked. We cannot take any issue, put it on an issue log, and just let it lay there. All issues have to be worked, and someone has to have responsibility for solving or resolving those issues. You can take an issue that's small, and if you don't address it, it can grow into a huge problem, and you don't want that to happen. Now, as we're managing stakeholders, our interpersonal and our team skills are going to be critical for us. We're going to have conflicts we have to deal with. What is the culture of the organization? What is the culture of your country or wherever it is you're working at? You have to be aware of that culture. Certainly take that into consideration. Negotiation. Did you know that a project manager has to be the world's best negotiator? You negotiate for everything. You don't have the sole power. You may be responsible for the project. You may have the power to manage that project, but there's always outside influences. There's always outside needs and outside requirements, and you have to negotiate to be able to complete your project on time, within budget, and within scope. Always a lot of negotiation takes place. Observation and conversation. What that means is you're out into the project. You're understanding what's going on in the project. Osmotic communications a lot of times is very important. Just by being in the presence of other people, you're hearing things being said and problems coming up and all sorts of things that are going on. You've got to be into the project. Political awareness. Every organization has a level of political involvement in it. Take the family business. The dad and two sons. Very political within that tight-knit group of people. And then communication skills, very important. Now you see here change request, and change request is an output of some of the other processes as well. So we learned something. We need to update the stakeholder register, or we need to update the stakeholder engagement plan. We issue a change request. Maybe we're adding a new stakeholder. Maybe we're changing how we're going to be engaging a stakeholder. We issue a change request to take care of that. So change request is a key output here. We are managing, and when we manage to the plan. Something in the plan may not be working. We need to change it. We will update. We update a lot. In a project, and you can see this on every process we've covered so far, where there are always updates to the project plan and the project documents. We learn more. Progressive elaboration, we update to reflect that new knowledge that we've learned. And that's what you see as a key output here also. To summarize managed stakeholder engagement, it is key to having a successful project. We have to keep our stakeholders informed. We have to understand our stakeholders. We have to be aware of their issues and aggressively work those issues. We have to manage those relationships. We have to communicate. Above all, keep our stakeholders engaged in the project, actively involved in it. Now, if I was looking at an Agile project, for example, in Agile, the stakeholders are quite often part of the project team. So they are actively engaged. In a traditional predictive type project, the stakeholders are not engaged full time, but we need to make sure that they're engaged at the appropriate level needed for that project. We monitor the stakeholder engagement process. Think about it this way. I have a plan, the stakeholder engagement plan. I'm executing that plan. I'm managing stakeholder engagement. I want to make sure that I'm executing that plan or in accordance with the plan. As I execute, I monitor, and I'm creating work performance data. Am I doing what I said I was going to do? Well, in monitor stakeholder engagement, we analyze that data and we create what's called work performance information. And that is how it's actually progressing. Is there a variance? Is there not a variance? We're looking at all aspects of the stakeholder engagement to see how we're really performing in those processes. So we verify actual stakeholder relationships, and we verify that, for example, the stakeholders are moving in the right direction. And if we need to make changes, then we would issue a change request and make those changes. So that's monitor stakeholder engagement process. Here's the structure. So first of all, I have my stakeholder engagement plan as an input. I have my issues log, which is something I want to stay on top of and analyze. I have my stakeholder register. But then right here I have that work performance data. That's the actual results of the stakeholder engagement. So I'm going to analyze those. I'm going to analyze the data right here to the plan, the stakeholder engagement plan, and I'm going to look for variance. I'm going to use things like alternatives analysis. Is there a better way? Root cause analysis. What is the root cause of any conditions that I might have? Stakeholder analysis. Multi-criteria decision analysis. Communications, SEAM, stakeholder engagement, assessment matrix. Interpersonal team skills. All of these are going to be vital tools that I will use in this process, and then I will create what's called the WPI, or work performance information, as an output. And that tells me, that WPI tells me how I am performing with regards to stakeholders. Then I have updates. Again, progressive elaboration. I learned something, I update to reflect that new information. Stakeholder engagement begins, we start monitoring it. We make sure that the plan is being followed and that it is working. We always want to address issues related to the stakeholders. We want to optimize the engagement of the stakeholders and document lessons learned. Lessons learned is basically documenting things that went well in this process or in this project, and things that didn't go so well that we don't want to repeat. Of course, the things that went well, we want to document them so that we have a future project, we can look back on it, and we can say, hey, this worked good, so I'm going to use this. Didn't go so well, I don't want to use it. So that's why we document lessons learned. And this is a factor of continuous improvement. We always want to continuously improve as a project manager. So we've talked about identify stakeholders, creating the stakeholder register, understanding who our stakeholders are. We have planned our stakeholder engagement, how we're going to engage our stakeholders into the project. We have managed stakeholder engagement. We've executed the stakeholder engagement plan. Then we monitor stakeholder engagement to make sure we're executing in accordance with the plan itself.